Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. Mexico is still far from attaining the international standard of free and fair elections, and experts say that recent experiences have not been promising in that regard. The elections in the state of Mexico are held up as a model by the ruling party candidate, and yet with the sheer number of complaints and the lack of definitive action on the part of authorities, the question is, a model of what? Today on Interviews from Mexico, we have a guest who's an expert in Mexican elections, and not just from a theoretical point of view. Gabriel Corona was a former member of the Electoral Council in the state of Mexico, a professor at the University of Mexico, and also has written numerous articles and books on Mexican elections and the electoral process. Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us here on Interviews from Mexico.
Thank you, Laura.
Gabriel, to start with, as a member of the Electoral Council of the state of Mexico, in elections that received a lot of attention here last year, what was it that you saw that could be warning signs for the national elections now in 2018?
Well, there were several things. From my point of view, there are three very important issues. The first issue is the intervention of the federal and state governments in the election through various social programs that were used to distribute a lot of resources that were oriented towards the coercion of voters and vote buying. The second thing is the capture of the electoral institutions, like the local electoral court, the State of Mexico's Electoral Institute, the National Electoral Court, and the National Electoral Institute. And I say that those institutions have been captured because the majority of their members are members of or supporters of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI. That's why they didn't stop the excesses committed by the PRI, working with the state and federal governments. And the third issue, I'd say, has to do with a series of practices that I call electoral terrorism, which have the goal of discouraging people from participating in the election, especially among the opposition. Imagine party members, party representatives, and citizens in general being threatened on election day with big heads, fake visits from the police, threatening of actions in vote.
Well, a number of these forms of intervention are actually pre-electoral. They take place in this period before the actual day of the elections, including both the capture of the state that you mentioned and some of the forms of fraud or coercion that go on. Are we already seeing that now in the national elections?
Of course. I think that the pink salary in the state of Mexico is evidence of that. And it has happened in many other places as well, for example, in Chiapas or Coahuila and other states.
Could you tell us what the pink salary is exactly?
The pink salary is a mechanism that was developed by Alfredo del Mazo, the current governor of the state of Mexico, and his campaign team. The idea is to offer economic support to every housewife in the state of Mexico, just for being a housewife. But the purpose was always clear, to buy votes by offering payments that voters would receive after the election.
So if I'm a housewife and I'm receiving this subsidy, the pink salary from the state, are they going to ask me for my voting credential? Are they going to, how do they demand that I vote for a certain party in order to receive what's a benefit that I should get anyway from the state?
Well, in all of these cases, they always ask for some kind of evidence that you voted the way you were asked to. Usually that takes the form of a photograph taken with a cell phone, and to make sure that the person took the photo, now they even ask for selfies with the voting ballot. So they ask for a photo of the ballot next to the face of the person who deposited the vote, so they can be sure that this person voted exactly the way they were asked to. The mechanism used to twist and distort the popular will are vast. And honestly, we need a lot of imagination to understand how far they're willing to go to stay in power at all costs.
So you have to deliver a selfie to the people who are operating the fraud in order to continue to get your benefits. And this is also a form of coercion that particularly affects women. Is that common?
In this case, it affects women, but the same thing happens with other social programs like scholarships for children who are in school, subsidies for rural areas, and all of these cases they ask for some kind of evidence, but it doesn't just happen in individual level. Sometimes they ask to get 5 or 10 other people and force them to do the same thing, and if you don't, they cut off you off from social programs and you'll lose your economic benefits.
So it's kind of a pyramid of fraud. How did you document these kinds of actions as a member of the Electoral Council?
That's right. It's a way of multiplying the fraud, of multiplying ways to distort the popular will. But the problem is that the State of Mexico's Election Institute made no effort to stop it. Even through Article 189 of the Law of Federal Judicial Power gives the General Counsel of the Electoral Institutes the power to conduct that kind of investigation when they are appropriate. They never did it. And the same thing happened with the National Electoral Institute. Then the complaints that were filed with the Special Prosecutor for Electoral Crimes weren't followed up, and now that Santiago Nieto has been fired, well, obviously, those investigations haven't been completed. And now that there's a new head of the Special Prosecutor's Office and a new prosecutor in charge of preliminary inquiries, who is a former member of the Attorney General Office of the State of Mexico, the chance of a real investigation happening are much lower. Probably all of these cases will be closed, not only on cases related to the last election, but the upcoming one.
So this is precisely the kind of capture of the institutions that you were talking about at the beginning. The complaints come in from the citizens, they go to the state level, they go to the national level, no one does anything, and in fact people who are more disposed to investigate and prosecute these electoral crimes are booted out.
That's right, that's the logic. In the case of the State of Mexico, they've taken the powers of investigation from the State Electoral Institute and given them to the State Electoral Court, which they have even more control over it, and the Electoral Institute of the State of Mexico, and the people who are chosen by the National Electoral Institute to be part of the state and local electoral institutes are chosen by a majority that supports the PRI and the National Electoral Institute, and that has the goal of maintaining the status quo. Filters like this one and many others that are used during an election process severely limit the opposition ability to be successful in elections.
So in the end, your experience as a member of the Electoral Council in the state of Mexico for these elections and in other occasions, how would you grade the electoral institutions?
Well, honestly, the clock has been turned way back. I've been an electoral advisor many times. The first time was in 1999 and 2000, during the federal election when an opposition candidate won the presidency for the first time in a while. Then in 2003 in the Federal Institutional, then between 2005 and 2008, I worked with the State of Mexico's Electoral Institute, and I want to say that I've seen a regression. Before, there was a real citizen-based Federal Electoral Institute in the first generation with Jose Goldenberg, Jacqueline Pechar, Mariano Merino, and Jesus Cantú, and really there's not much left of that. Since 2013, they started the process of rolling back the gains, I say, with the appointment of the general councils, and that tendency has been reinforced with the last few appointments of the members of the General Council of the National Electoral Institute and the members of the councils of the local election authorities around the country. country. I think they've given up on the possibility of having citizens waiting at the highest levels of elections authorities. They're privileging the electoral technocrats, the electoral bureaucracy, the electoral class, the people who have been in this work environment for many years and want to stay there. They don't want complications, and they usually accept whatever is imposed them. So usually they follow the instruction of the National Electoral Institute or the local election authorities and rarely even question them.
Well, we have kind of a paradox here then, because they began building these electoral institutions to create a stronger foundation for democracy here in Mexico, and it's gone downhill, as you say, but at the same time we've had more and more money invested, more and more regulations. What's the problem here that we haven't been able to create a solid base, and in fact that we've seen this kind of retrocession that you've talked about?
Well, it's because they haven't changed the mechanism to choose the members of the National Electoral Institute's general councils. They're still chosen by party quotes, so they're still in some way representatives of the parties. Even if they are not party members themselves, they still keep following the directions of the legislative party groups that choose them. So I think that in that area, there's been a real move backwards, because after the independence that they had shown, especially in the first phase of the General Council of the National Electoral Institute, they've been losing that independence, and we see a lot of former council members who now hold public office. And we see in election campaigns that reflects the fact that they were never impartial, that they saw being a council member as holding a position of power for the political party that helped them get there.
Well, this is a serious challenge to the Mexican system, because the justice system in terms of electoral crimes is really the only way to enforce the laws themselves. But let's go back to the voting day. The third area that you discussed of fraud and coercion that could be a real problem in the 2018 elections had to do with what you called electoral terror. Could you describe that a little more for us?
Well, it was a general practice in the state of Mexico. It started with phone calls late at night that were supposedly from a candidate asking for the people's support, but the calls come really late at night, in the middle of the night.
A candidate of the opposition.
It was Delfina Gomez, the candidate for Morena. They asked for support for her, but since they called at 3 or 4 in the morning, he usually did the opposite and made people mad at her for bothering them in the middle of the night. It started with that, but it got broader. During the days closer to the election day, they left big heads outside of some of the offices of the Morena party, and in some places where polling stations were being set up. And that's not all. They called Morena representatives, threatening them that if they show up on election day, something was going to happen to them or their family. In other cases, they did express kidnappings of some representatives. They harassed a federal deputy in Tejupilco, in the southern part of the state. They raided a house where a group of Morena representatives was staying, arguing that they had illegal firearms. Obviously, they took a video and uploaded it, and it showed that they had absolutely nothing, that the raid was really about making their work more difficult, which in the end was successful, because on election day, that party wasn't able to send poll watchers to all of the polling stations. There were a lot of people who didn't show up because of fear of violence, and obviously, they had an effect. But that's still not all. As I already said, there were funeral wreaths left as threats, cars set on fire with threatening messages towards that party and its candidate, and it got to the point that there were situations that are really inconceivable for a supposedly democratic system. And then there's the fake police citations. Santiago Neto, who was the special prosecutor for electoral crimes, wrote in the book The Electoral Hell, coordinated by Bernardo Barranco, in which I also have an article. His article is called The Elections of Never. One of the things he wrote is, I have never before seen a group of elderly people crying because they didn't want to spend the last day of their lives in jail. They were scared because they had received citations from special prosecutors for supposed electoral crimes, citations to show up on Sunday, election day. So there was a lot of fear around the citation. And it could happen again in this upcoming election, but on an even larger scale.
So we have a series of direct threats and threatening measures carried out by members of the government, institutions of the government, and then we have some that are carried out by actors unknown without full investigations to ever find out who they were, that particularly were targeted toward poll watchers of the opposition. And your feeling is this had a direct effect on the results of the elections?
Well, it's hard to estimate how much influence it had. But I have one more example. Starting a few days before Election Day, and on Election Day, there were sheets handed out from the State of Mexico election authorities with instructions for what to do. For example, if there were a shootout at polling places. Imagine what that means. I said, get down on the ground, don't run, etc. So when people started seeing that on social media, especially through WhatsApp, it basically made them think that there could be conflicts at polling places. And obviously, some people probably avoided participating because of that. It's impossible to estimate how many people read that and what effect it had. But what I can say is that the PRI usually does better when there's a low turnout, because they know that their hardcore base is enough to win a tight election, and that the more people who stay at home, the more likely they are to win. The more people who participate, obviously, the PRI is less likely to win, because the margins by which they need to manipulate the results in their favor need to be larger. And obviously, it's not always possible because of the presence of poll watchers, the presence of observers, the presence of some authorities. So, the smaller the margin is, the easier it is for them to change the result through various strategies, like manipulating the popular will at the ballot, boxes when they can, making mistakes with the arithmetic that always benefit the PRI, and hurting whoever is threatening the PRI's change of victory. And of course, they use their control over the electoral institution from the general councils to the district and municipal councils, and they interfere while the votes are being counted and when the ballots are being brought to the district council. So they do a lot of different things that really add up. One vote here, two there, three there, five somewhere else. It can change the outcome of the election, and that might surprise some people, but it's an effect of election manipulation. A lot of things that happened last year in the state of Mexico are happening again now. For example, in the state of Mexico, there was an independent candidate, and her signatures, the petition signatures that she had gathered, were just as suspicious as those of Margarita Zavala or Jaime Rodríguez el Bronco. I was personally reviewing a lot of those signatures, and I voted again allowing that candidate on the ballot, but eventually the effect that the independent candidate had was, as a woman, to take voters away from the main opposition candidate, the Morena candidate Delfina Gomez. And in the end, the almost 200,000 votes that the independent candidate got were enough to change the outcome of the election. It's basically the same thing when they're trying to do now with Jaime Rodríguez Calderón, who, even though there were some very obvious irregularities in his petitions, he was allowed to register as an independent candidate, even though the National Electoral Institute had denied his candidacy at first. But what happened was that the Electoral Court, which was mostly made up of people designated by the PRI, and the PRI had just extended their mandates. The Electoral Court ended up allowing the Bronco to register, which is having negative consequences for the electoral competition, because we could possibly have a president, it's very unlikely, but we could have a president who had a lot of irregularities in his petition and his expenses as he was gathering signatures.
And to possibly take away votes from another candidate who got on the ballot without the kind of suspicions that surround those independent candidates. What you've told us then is that the ruling party is betting on abstention in order to create a situation where they can win elections that they're obviously way down in the polls. In that sense, violence is one of the means that's been used in Mexico State. And you recently wrote a column in a national newspaper talking about violence in general, not just electoral violence, as a red flag in these elections. What kind of an impact does this high level of violence that Mexico has suffered nationwide have on an electoral process?
Well, what happened in the state of Mexico, which was the result of deliberate actions by the group in power, now we're seeing it happen again in certain ways at a federal level. Although a lot of the violence is now being caused by organized crime, especially drug cartels. The number of candidates and politicians that have been killed since the beginning of the national electoral process, well, the figures vary, but according to some of them, 79 people have been killed since last September. So far, in 2018, there have been around 28 people killed. And obviously, this has a psychological effect on voters, sending a message that politics is a very dangerous activity, and getting involved in politics is very dangerous. And we can add the recent experience of the state of Mexico or the state of Coahuila, where there were many irregularities and actions to create fear among the people when they were trying to express themselves politically and trying to vote. It seems to me that many parts of the country have turned into hot spots for this kind of violence. And that's something that the National Electoral Institute is denying. And even if they deny it without much enthusiasm, especially the State of Mexico Electoral Institute, but there are parts of the country that are truly a state within a state. In the southern part of the state of Mexico, organized crime groups have an incredible level of control, and even local governments pay rent to those groups. As an electoral advisor, I experienced visiting those places, and afterwards, one of my colleagues in that region was threatened, and I had to resign. I received a message that said they had my license plate number, they knew what car I was driving, and that they were going to be watching my work. But it's not just things like that. Some of the Institute's activities had to be suspended or delayed because of the organized crime groups didn't want us to put up posters. They didn't want us to broadcast messages on loudspeakers, for example. And I think that this place is already a hotspot of violence. And even if they deny it, it's a major threat, not just to social peace, but also to political stability, and above all, to the electoral process that we're living through.
Electoral authorities have not confronted this problem.
From my experience in the state of Mexico, the electoral institutions have an apparent interest in fixing those problems, but there are also a lot of delays. And from my point of view, there is a lack of political will to guarantee that every resident of the state of Mexico be able to express their popular will before and after the electoral process. In some regions of the country, now that I'm working in election observation, I've written to people in Tamaulipas, for example, and they've told me, I do election observation, but only in Ciudad Victoria. I don't go to other places, especially Reynosa, because it's very dangerous. I will be in danger. It seems to me that stories like these are enough evidence to conclude that there are hotspots for electoral violence that the authorities haven't wanted to recognize and address. A similar statement was made a few days ago by the president of the National Human Rights Commission, Israel González Pérez, and another statement was made by the executive secretary of the Inter-American Human Rights Court. He also made a statement. Lorenzo Córdoba has also expressed concerns in some way, but I think they need to take a stronger stand against political and electoral violence, not only against candidates, but also against citizens who have been subject to various kinds of repression for expressing themselves publicly. In the state of Mexico, I can talk about recent experience. People were beaten, people were threatened. In some cases, they were not allowed to hold demonstrations in public plazas. Now, in the state of Mexico, some business owners who put up posters that don't support the PRI are being subject to repression. So it doesn't seem like a free environment to me. And every democratic election should happen in a free environment. If it doesn't, it's not a democratic system. It's some other type of system.
Absolutely. You mentioned elections observation, and you formed part directly of a new effort to organize citizen election observation throughout the country. What role can citizens play in observing elections to try to prevent some of these actions and forms of fraud that you've mentioned during the interview? Nice.
Yes, well, the Dialogues of Democracy program of the National University started a national network called the University and Citizens Network for Democracy. And its goal is to carry out elections observation across the entire country. They're not trying to do the kind of elections observation where there are silent witnesses or flies on the wall. They hope their elections observation will help limit vote buying and voter coercion, which have been the most common practices in recent elections. Vote buying and voter coercion are basic instruments that have been used to twist the popular will in the elections in the state of Mexico and Coahuila. And the Citizens University Network, which is not affiliated to any political party, is trying to bring together different citizens and academic organizations to try to guarantee the legality of the election, guarantee transparency, and guarantee that citizens will be able to express themselves freely on election day. And above all, that on election day the results be fairly counted in the district counting sessions. But we need to recognize that there are important limitations, because the election observers can only publish reports about what they saw. They cannot challenge the results. The political parties still have a monopoly on being able to challenge results. So we need to think about changing that law in the future so that any citizen, whether or not they're members of a political party, have the right to report irregularities, not just crimes, but also other electoral irregularities that happen at the polls and that can change the results of the election.
It's a huge challenge, but certainly this kind of organization of the citizenry to protect the democracy is fundamental to moving toward improving the system here in Mexico. Gabriel Corona, thanks so much for being with us here on Interviews from Mexico.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back next week.